Hello, it's me, Circuit 3. I'm going to try doing something I haven't done before. This is a track for a project I'm working on. There'll be no vocals, it's all synthesizers. So nerds assemble, and don't laugh when I do stupid stuff. And there will be a lot of stupid stuff, mostly involving me doing cables. For those of you who are interested in this sort of thing, no computer being used in this except maybe to record it. But the actual equipment is all going to use old school CV and gate, which I kind of sort of know how to use, but also don't know how to use. So let's begin. Right, so the first bit of equipment I'm going to use is this. It's the ERM multi-clock. I think it's been rebranded now as the floating point instruments multi-clock or something. Anyhow, what this does, and it's the heartbeat of my studio, it provides the clock timing information for anything that uses tempo. So it has MIDI output, and if you don't know what MIDI is, it doesn't matter because I'm refusing to use it today. Today I'm going to use analog, which is a little voltage. I think it's 5 volts that comes out of it. I'm not 100% sure. But what I'm going to do is take it and connect it to this, which is a sequencer. It's a Behringer clone of an old sequencer. I think it's from synthesizers.com or Moog or something, but it's an old school sequencer, the sort of thing that I think Moog made in the 70s and was used by the likes of Tangerine Dream. And I know it looks hugely complicated, but those knobs all pretty much do the same job, I think. So I can start it. Okay, I'm going to hit this. So you can see there, look, it's all moving across there. And that tempo there is determined by the speed of this oscillator. So I'm going to turn it down really slow, and it's going really slow. I'm going to take it down another level, really slow, really slow. In fact, it's barely moving. Here, I'll turn it up a little bit. And then really, really slow. We could be waiting, so I'm not going to bother. Okay, that's all well and good, but I want to use this as the master clock. Why? Because later on I'm going to use this as well, and I want them all to be using the same time bases. Right, so let me stop that. So what should happen is that when I plug this in here, and I think it's here, it's the shift input, what's supposed to happen is every voltage pulse that goes in there shifts this along by 1. So let's see, and just to test it, what I'll do is I will put this on a really fast tempo, something silly like 136 beats a minute. You wouldn't dance to that. So here we go. So it should start going red, which means, yeah, it's sending out the clock pulse, and it's doing nothing. Right, why isn't it working then? So I need to figure out, is it because, so I'm going to do it manually. Have I got the correct cable plugged in? Probably not. I have too many cables knocking around here. So let's see. There we go. It would probably help if I used the correct cable, wouldn't it? There it is. Right. How come all those brilliant YouTubers never have this problem? That's because they're professional. Ah, and bingo. So, rule 1, use the right cable. Okay, so there we go. It's doing what I wanted it to do. So if I hit stop here, you'll see it'll stop pulsing, and it's stop pulsing here. Okay, that's the first bit. Now what I need to figure out is this, and this is kind of tricky. I'm going to use this synthesizer. That's the Moog, Mini Moog Model D, Moog Model D, and I think people call it the Mini Moog. I can never remember which came first. This is the 2016 reissue. I'm really pleased with it. It nearly killed the postman trying to deliver it. So I need to figure out how to use these connections here. So on the back here, you can see we're MIDI. And if I was anyway sane, I would just use MIDI, but it's more fun experimenting with voltages. So there's the control outputs. There's, okay, send a signal in, there's the audio output, but at the very end here, we've got interesting stuff. We have got the ability to send what people call control inputs. So we've got things to control loudness, filter, oscillator. So I'm going to try and control the oscillator and the trigger with this. I'm not quite sure how to do it, but I'm going to go back over there, sit down, and we'll figure it out together. Right then, so the oscillator input, I've checked in the manual. That's where you tell the synthesizer what note to play if you're controlling it from a box like this. So I think the correct output is one of these here. These are actually two output sockets with the same signal. So what I think should happen is if I hit play on this. Okay, so why aren't I hearing anything? Probably because the synthesizer knows the pitch of the note, but it doesn't know for how long to play it. But if I hold down a key, no, I'm still not doing it. So I need to figure out, how do I tell the synthesizer when the note begins and ends? Because all it's telling it at the moment is the pitch. So I need to scratch my head for a minute and figure that out. Right, so I think I've made a bit of progress. The output suggests to me that that's telling it what the output of this first note here is. So if I hit that, okay, so that's doing something. So if I hit start on this, I'm going to ignore the multi-clock for now and keep it simple. So if I hit start, okay, so I'm not hearing that. Ah, I'm hearing the first one. Right, so that tells me the beginning and end of the note comes from the output, but I can't put 8 of those into one synthesizer. But if I look to the far right, I suspect this one at the end is the one. No, it's not. Maybe it's this one. It's not. So how do I do it? Yeah, so I can only do one at a time. That's very confusing, isn't it? So what I think I have to do is be creative and use the same clock pulse from that. Okay, I think that's what I need to do. So here's my problem. I need to use this to tell this what speed to go at, the tempo. It sends an electrical pulse to here. But I also need to use this to tell this when the notes begin and end. But I can't do that. But what I can do is, and I'm so glad I bought these extra adapters, I can do this. So if I plug this in here.
Find this on the web.
Shut up, Siri. And I'll try this. What I'm doing is I'm taking the output from that, telling it what time it is. I'm taking the same signal and I'm going to send it into that, but at the same time, it's going to go back out to the synthesizer to tell it when the notes begin and end. This might work or it might be a complete disaster. Let's see. So if I hit play on this, it's going to start telling the sequencer to move. Bingo! Great, it's a bit fast though. It's a bit fast. Slow down the tempo. Right, I'm feeling very clever now. That's all great. So I can't do a piece of music with one note. So where do I go next? So at this point, you probably have a very reasonable question for me. Why are you doing this? Why are you like just avoiding using MIDI and you're using old voltage stuff? First, because I can. And second, because it's a bit fun. And third, voltage control of synthesizers is far better. And it's not just my opinion, it's an opinion shared by many synthesizer users, because MIDI, by its very nature, is limited. It's an old protocol developed, I think, in 82. Yeah, 82, I think, is when they got the spec for it. And frankly, I've encountered so many issues with it that I can see timing problems with it. As soon as you get something in time, it starts going out of time, or you get the odd beat that's slightly off. And Vince Clarke himself, the master, the Professor Vince Clarke, he figured out, because he measured it with oscilloscopes, because he had a lot of time in his hands. And he was wondering why the B-side of Groove is in the Heart by Delight just sounded so perfect. And it had a really solid, consistent tempo. And he discovered they were using old analog equipment to drive it all. So as a result, he did some checks and he said, yeah, my suspicions were right. MIDI's not great. So I'm going to go back to voltages. And as a result, we got the Chorus album, which happens to be my favorite Erasure album. And many of you will probably agree it's a very fine album. So that's why I'm doing it. So now that I've figured out how to get the note pitch sent to the Moog and how to get this sequencer to go in time based on the ERM multi-clock up there, and at the same time send the note on-off information out to the Moog. And there's probably a better way to do this. I don't know. I can't be bothered looking it up, so I'm going to run with this. So this is where we're at. I can play. So it starts. Great. Slow down the tempo. That's great. So I can do tricks like this. I can skip notes, so it's just constantly doing that note, and it's just going between those two. So basically, you can tell it to skip one of these. So if you look there, you'll see where it says skip. If you don't believe me, look there. You see that? What if I do this? Say, I'm going to cross all four, and then when I tell it to stop, stuck on that. Why is it still going? It's still going because this is still going. I'm going to stop it now because it's not very melodic. So how do I make a melody? Right then, let's try this. For a moment, just humor me. I'm going to just use the internal clock on this, okay? Is it not going to work? No, of course it's not going to work. So let me hit start on this. And I'm going to tell it to go between these two notes here. Right then. So how do I make this more interesting? This is how I'm going to do it. So I'm going to hit start on this. And we'll just do these two notes first. So the top row, what this is sending is a voltage. The higher the voltage, the higher the note. The lower the voltage, the lower the note. So if I turn this up a little bit, there we go. So you see now how the voltage changing does that? And this here increases the overall frequency range. So I'm going to assume if I bring it down, no, not that one. It must be, oh, it's this one over here, look. Where it says ×2, ×1, ×4. So it's multiplying the voltage. There we go. So that's how you bring it up and down in octaves, and then I can just let all of these go. So it's now going to do 8 different notes. And then if I just hit randomly, there we go. We're already getting towards a melody. That's all well and good, but the sound isn't very interesting, is it? So let's go over to the Moog and make this a bit more interesting. Right then, this is where I get well out of my depth, because as soon as I start videoing something on one of these instruments, it doesn't work the way I expect it to. So this is the Mini Moog Model D. So synthesizer experts, and there's a lot of you out there who know more about this than me, but in summary, what you've got, ignore this bit at the beginning. This is just where you do your master tuning and a couple of other settings. So ignore that for a minute. You've basically got 1, 2, 3 oscillator. An oscillator makes a sound. Here's one oscillator on its own. Oh, you can't hear it because I've plugged this in. Just a moment. So it's making a very quiet click because I've turned everything down. So there's your oscillators. That makes the sound. You switch them on and off here. And you can see 1, 2, 3. There's a couple of other switches because there's a couple of other sound sources you can mix in. You can mix in an external one, and also you can make noise. And I know some of you are thinking, yeah, that's right, you make noise. So we'll come back to that. And then you've got your filter, and the filter shapes the sound. And then you've got your envelope here, and the envelope decides, does the sound start immediately, or is there a slow build up? Does it go to a long fade on each note, or is it like a very short burst of a note? Talking about it doesn't make sense. So why don't we start the sequencer? You can't see it, but I'm hitting start on the multi-clock. Okay, there it goes. It's a dreadful tune, so I want to keep it on one note for now. So there you go. So what's happening here is it's playing this oscillator here, oscillator 1. You can change the waveform. It'll make different types of sounds. That's your raw oscillator sound. So let's say I wanted to do something like this. I wanted it to be longer, so I want it to ring out a bit. I can do this. Very short. And then if I put the sustain level up, you can hear the note lasts a little longer. So if you liken this to how long you hit the keys on the keyboard, how long do you hold the note for? How long do you sustain the note for? Now, so that could be a bass sound maybe, who knows? So next thing I'm going to change is this bit here. This is the filter. So what it's going to do is, it makes the oscillator sound very dull, muffled. That's because it's rolling off a whole bunch of frequencies and only allowing some of them through. So then as I open it up, and if I open up the filter all the way, you get every harmonic, you get every single sound that's available. You can do things like emphasis, which is also known as the filter cutoff, and then the resonance. So it's cutoff and resonance. So the best way of describing resonance is by turning it up. You hear that? So it emphasizes certain frequencies up there, those harmonics up there. Very useful. And then you've got contour. I'll come back to that because it'll only get silly in a minute. So we've got the attack time, decay time. I'm going to keep them fairly short. So now, let's go back to these oscillators. What happens if I add a second oscillator? So I'm going to turn it right down. I'm going to add this one. It's a subtle change you may not be able to hear on the microphone. So there it is, up there, a bit higher. There we go. So that's the second oscillator on its own. Turn it off, back on, okay? And I'll use a different type of waveform for it, that one there. So it's up at the top range of the available octaves. There it is at the very top. Let's add the first oscillator back in. You hear how they ring against each other? That's where you start getting some richness in the sound. And this is where you start playing with the filter cutoff to do different things. And you hear the dissonance there from the resonance going up. So I'm going to keep the envelope pretty short on it so that you can hear each note separately. Now what I'm going to do is take this down, because when it's too high it gets too uninteresting. I'm going to add in the third oscillator. There it is, a bit too high for my liking. I do like square waves. Let me just do a pulse width now. Right, I can hear it there. And if I add, what I can do is detune these. So you can create a chord. Let me add the first one back in. What if I turn this up? Oscillator 1 and 2. Let's detune oscillator 2 by tuning it up. It's about an octave between them. Yeah, okay. Let Let me add this one in. Not as interesting as it could be. Okay, let's add in oscillator 1, oscillator 2, turn on oscillator 3. Okay, that's getting very interesting now. What if I change the K time? Now it sounds like it's somebody actually playing a keyboard, playing more than one note. And how about I play with the frequency of the filter cut off? And maybe take the pitch of this one down, the third oscillator. Okay, now we're getting into really interesting stuff. What if I do this? Noise. Let me explain what noise is. Noise is basically every frequency, and there's two kinds, white noise, pink noise. Subtle difference between them. It sounds a little bit like a snare drum, doesn't it? Let me open up the filter so you can hear it. Sounds very much like a snare drum. Useful for percussion sounds. Where this gets interesting is when you add it very subtly to more musical sounds. I'm gonna turn it up so it's stupidly loud. Sometimes you can add a bit of character to the sound. You don't have to just use it for percussion. I'm going to take the frequency cutoff down, because in a minute I'm going to try and experiment with this. Right then, it's a bit boring on just one repeated note, so let's try something new. So, it's a bit boring when it's just one note, and that's it there. It's being set by that control there. Maybe two notes. Still not great, and I'm going to explain one of the things I dislike about this in a second, but what if I just turn them all on? It's not very tuneful, so I need to try and figure this out. Like, why is it like that? Here's the reason it's doing this is that there's no notches on this, so this is just varying a voltage. So it's going in between the notes, which is why it sounds so tuneless. Some people would consider this beautiful. Those people are all slightly mad. I much prefer things to conform to the traditional 12-step scale. I'm a bit weird like that. So how will I fix that? I think I have an idea. So here's the problem I've got that I need to figure out. Let me just start playing it. So, same note, and it's coming from here. So, if you're a musician, you're probably noticing that it's going to all the notes in between, because there's no notches on this. So, what I need to figure out is how can I get that to correspond to notes. I remember buying this for a reason, and now I remember what that reason was. It's called a quantizer, and people who do electronic music will recognize a quantizer as something that puts something in time, but it can actually put things in tune. So at the very end there, see it? I need to get it so that it will step up and up each actual keyboard notes. For some non-musicians, if you're listening and watching and you haven't lost interest, here's what I mean. If you go from here to here, they're solid steps and they're predictable, but this yoke here, because it's voltages, is going in between the notes. And while you jazz heads might think that that's perfectly fine, I'm sorry, but I can't be having with this nonsense around quarter notes and all that sort of stuff. The in-between notes, they're probably the devil's notes, so we're not going to go there. What I've done is I've taken the output from the sequencer here, and I've sent it to the input of the quantizer, And then I've taken the output of the quantizer here, and I'm going to take that and send it into the Moog. So what should happen is, this voltage that comes out, if it's in between a note, this quantizer will round it up or round it down to the nearest note. Okay, let's see if that works. So what should happen is this. Let me hit, the clock is starting. So if I go here and start adjusting it, instead of getting in between notes, I should get actual, like a scale. So like no in between jazz notes. Hooray! So what does that mean? It means I can start using all of these again. Now, it's not the greatest melody in the world, but it does sound like they're all being played on the same keyboard by a sane person and not one of those mad jazz musicians. So let's see what happens if I do this. There we go. So I'll add in the other oscillators. Remember how I took the oscillators on the synthesizer and I set them all to different pitches? So let's add back in oscillator 2. I'm going to change the envelope to make the notes last longer. No. Okay, make them shorter. I kind of like the percussive feel of it. Add in the third oscillator. Turn up the tempo. So I'm using voltages to control the synthesizer, but there's one more thing I'd like to try. And I need to go get a cable to do it. Be right back. So we're back at the Mini Moog. I'm going to do something because I would prefer just to keep the notes simple. So I'm going to tune all of the 3 oscillators to the same note. So let me just do that. Let me hit the sequencer and just tell it to start playing slowly. So there's oscillator 1. So it's playing that first note, just one note at a time. Keep it simple. There's oscillator 1. I'm gonna retune it. I don't want any chords at the moment. Ever so slightly out of tune, and you get that lovely sound off it, where it's just ever so slightly out of tune. And then if I add back in oscillator 3, this top row here is sending out voltages that changes the pitch. You'll notice though, there's another 2 rows, so I could in theory use these for something else, and that's exactly what I'm going to do, because look, these voltages go along in a line and they go to this output here, the red cable. So what if I took the second row and use that for something? This is what I'm going to use it for. Do you remember these inputs? And there's one of them marked filter. So I'm going to see what happens when I send a voltage to that filter from the sequencer. I've now connected that black cable here, which corresponds to this row of knobs here, to the filter control input on the Moog. And if I hit play up there on the master clock, it'll start playing just this note. Sometimes it's easier to work with a single note at a time. So this here is down to 0, so it's probably giving it practically no volts. And you can hear the sound is quite dull. So what if I start turning this up? It's opening up the filter. And if I adjust the filter on the synth itself, I can can set the midpoint to somewhere that I'm okay with, but it means every time it gets to this note, I want it to open up even more, to sound brighter like that. So let's turn on the other notes and see what happens. I'm going to turn all of these down to the lowest voltage, all the way down, all the way down. Right, let's let them go. Turn them back on. When we get back to that first note, it should sound brighter, and it does. So let's get note 7. Let's turn that one up. So when we get to 7, so we can start adjusting these to open and close at different points. So it's taking the filter and adjusting the sound at different places. Isn't that rather clever? Let's turn up the speed. And faster. Now what's happening is row 2 of that sequencer is adjusting this, which is cool. So what if I run this and hit start? I'm going to find a good mid-ground, because I want, when it's opened up wide, I want it to really stand out. So there we go. Isn't that clever? So it gives a bit of interest. So even if the melody's not great, it opens up the filter on different notes. I'm going to do a few tweaks to this. If you haven't lost interest, this is what I'm going to do next. So I've got a couple of pedals which are all connected to the interfaces and all the rest of it. I'm going to use the Big Sky, which is a lovely, lovely, lovely reverb pedal, to basically add a little bit of reverb, because it's the reverb pedal, to the sound. But what you'll probably and hopefully notice, despite the microphone on this phone that I'm using, is what it brings to the sound. It really emphasizes the harmonics, which is lovely. Right, I'm going to turn up the reverb here. It sounds almost like water drops, especially when the filter opens. What if I add delay to it? Just adding echo. Now we're getting into Tangerine Dream territory. So let's do some more trickery with this. How about we do this? I'm just going to adjust the filter on a couple of these. Feeling very clever with myself, because I managed to do that without too much cheating and looking up instructions in the manual. So I thought, what else can I do? And I've never tried this before. I've just discovered something interesting on the back of the Moog that I haven't really seen on other mono synths, and maybe it's just because of the terminology that Moog use. So it's this here that says loudness. So I've plugged the cable in, and as you've probably guessed, I've plugged it into this third output here for this third row of knobs that I'm not using. So what happens if I press play now? Nothing, but that's because these are all turned down to 0 on row 3. See them? They're all at 0. So if I turn this one up. So now what this lets me do is adjust I think it's letting me adjust the volume of each of these. I have to see now. So you can hear the first note is a bit louder than the others because I've turned it up full. I'm going to play with this for a little bit, see what happens when I adjust the loudness on certain notes. Let me put them all up full. No, I won't actually. I'm going to experiment a bit here. So maybe if I get the... if I turn range up here on the far right, so you'll see that. Oh, stop Siri, I didn't ask you to do anything. Ah, that's interesting. So this control here increases the voltage all up, and then these knobs adjust the increments. If I go to times 4, okay, it's very loud now. Okay, interesting. From this little box, that little synth, well, not so little, and a couple of effects units. Right, that's all well and good, but I have this box. What happens if I take this clock output here and plug it into this clock input here of the lovely Moog subharmonicum, which I'm not going to explain now because I sort of kind of understand it, but at the same time I don't. So let's do that. Let's just plug the clock in there and let's just plug it into that. So now the subharmonicum is getting the same clock as everything else. What happens? So what I've done is I've taken the clock that everything else is listening to, so it knows what time it is. It goes to the clock input here. Okay. And if I hit play on this, nothing will happen because the clock's not running. So I'm going to tell the clock to start by hitting play here. I'm going to turn down the Moog for a minute. Okay, so I've turned down the mini Moog and I'll turn up the volume of this. Now, this is getting interesting. This is the subharmonicum. It does some really interesting things. I've used it on a lot of tracks and it's doing very simple rhythms. But what if I turn the Moog back up so we can hear 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's see what happens when I turn the Moog back up, the mini Moog over there. So a couple of things will be apparent. They're not in tune with each other. The sounds don't yet complement each other. And it's a bit boring. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. I'm going to fiddle with this for a minute. Be right back and I'll show you what I've made. So what I'm doing, I've got this playing the same note. It's playing roughly the same scale as the mini Moog. So if I add in the sub frequency, it's a bit low, you won't hear it, but you'll hear it in the mix. I'll share this later. So you're getting this, that lovely bass. Okay, let's get more interesting now. Add in the second sub on this voice here. So this is a single oscillator, sorry. Okay, it's the same note over and over, so I'm going to start changing it. of interesting. I'm going to bring in the second oscillator here. Interesting. So I'm going to get the second oscillator to make something that's in tune and interesting. And I'm going to adjust the notes. Okay, now it's getting interesting. I'm going to adjust some of the settings on this. And what I'm doing there is I'm changing the filter settings. I'm going to change the envelope, which is determining whether the note starts suddenly or fades in. Turn down the mini Moog for a minute so you can hear this on its own. Now the magic happens. The magic's going to happen when I start adding a little bit of effect to it. So I'm going to add the Volante, which is a kind of a tape effect delay box sitting over there on the other table. Now, if I bring the Moog back in, the Moog Mini Moog, I won't lie, I'm feeling very pleased with myself because I didn't think this would work. So I think what I'll do is I will play one of my polysynths and just play on top of it. I have no idea what it's going to sound like, but I'll record it and share it. Okay, this has been interesting, and it's planned for a project that I'm working on that I can't talk about at the moment because if it sounds like crap, I'm not going to release it. So let me put the camera up here and I'll play, and then I'll deliberately put some wrong notes in. So if you hear the wrong notes, well done, you've spotted them.